what I'd like to mention here is everything with Harry is contrived by the people who are driving him. Now, it's coincidental that it should happen and be published today, the very day that the king goes to Golders Green to meet the very people who were attacked a couple of weeks ago.
Prince Harry's New Statesman essay on rising anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom was published on the exact day that King Charles visited Golders Green in North London to meet the Jewish community members who had been attacked a couple of weeks earlier. And the coincidence is not a coincidence. The timing is, in Dickie Arbiter's professional assessment, contrived. Arbiter served as press secretary to the late Queen Elizabeth II and to King Charles III. And his framing on the New Statesman timing carries the operational weight of someone who has watched royal public relations calibration at the highest level across decades. The pattern Arbiter identifies is operationally consistent across multiple recent episodes. The Sussex household releases content calibrated to compete with institutional engagements that the senior royal figures are conducting at the substantive level. The Bondi Beach one-off commercialization occurred during the period of the Australian tour. The Archie 7th birthday Instagram drop occurred on the day Catherine announced her first foreign engagement since cancer treatment. The dog biscuit launch occurred during the Trooping the Colour ceremony, at which Catherine made her first post-cancer appearance. The New Statesman essay publication is the most recent iteration of the structural pattern. Harry produces content on a sensitive, substantive subject at the precise moment Charles is conducting substantive institutional engagement on the same subject in the most operationally appropriate location. This is the central operational reading of the Royally Unfiltered broadcast, hosted by Kinsey Schofield this week, with two of the most senior sources in British royal commentary, Hugo Vickers, the institutional historian whose new personal history of Queen Elizabeth II draws on more than 60 years of personal observation, and Dickie Arbiter, the former press secretary to two reigning monarchs. The framing both bring to the New Statesman.
This will air on Friday. She's currently on day 2 of her trip to Italy. We saw her making pasta. We've seen her cuddled up with beautiful children, speaking Italian to them. It's really been just kind of an incredible experience to see her up and running, and it seems like feeling a lot better than she was a few years ago.
Vickers' professional reading is that the essay does not sound like Harry. If Vickers were Harry's English master at school, Vickers would be wondering whether the student had been cheating. The language register of the essay does not match the documented voice of Harry's earlier institutional communications. The structural meaning is that the essay has been substantially constructed by professional writers operating around Harry rather than written by Harry himself in any meaningful sense. The structural problem with this construction is that it positions Harry as the author of substantive policy commentary in a subject area where his own documented record disqualifies him from credibility. Harry was photographed in 2005 wearing a Nazi uniform at a costume party. The cumulative documentary record on this incident is now 21 years old.
Well, it is absolutely good news that she is back on the road proper, that she's back on the international road too. And it must have been a little bit of a walk down memory lane, because she was in Italy for quite a few months before she went to St Andrews at a British institute to study history of art and also learn Italian, which is why she was able to put her Italian to good use on the visit.
The decision to position Harry as the public commentator on anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom requires the audience to ignore the documentary record that makes the positioning operationally untenable. The Arbiter framing on Harry's broader political positioning is structurally consequential. The convention that members of the royal family do not engage in political commentary is operationally fundamental to the institutional architecture. Members of the royal family operate above politics. They are trained from birth to represent the nation rather than to express positions on contested political questions. The convention is what allows the institution to perform its diplomatic and ceremonial functions across changes of government and across the full political spectrum without operational complication. Harry's New Statesman essay engages directly with the political question of how the United Kingdom should respond to rising anti-Semitism, including positions on the Middle East and on the relationship between protest activity and prejudice against the Jewish community. The structural meaning is that Harry has, on Arbiter's reading, violated the convention. The violation is structurally serious because Harry has previously claimed on multiple occasions, including the Kiev Security Forum statement, that he remains a working royal doing what he was born to do.
She's obviously thoroughly enjoyed every single minute because the Italians are very family oriented. So it's quite interesting, this project that they're doing in Reggio Emilia, that it is a sort of kind of early learning center where hitherto you expect the Italian families to do it within the family confines rather than in a kind of open institute. And this has been a very interesting exercise for her because she's obviously learned a lot from it.
The working royal framing carries with it the Convention Against Political Commentary. The New Statesman publication violates the framing Harry himself has been deploying. The audience reading both elements simultaneously can read the operational contradiction. The New Statesman publication outlet itself carries the additional structural significance Arbiter develops. The New Statesman occupies a political position substantially to the left of centre in the British political landscape. Publication in the New Statesman positions the author within a defined ideological register that has known operational meaning to British political observers. Harry's choice to publish in this specific outlet, rather than in a more centrist publication, is itself an operational political signal. The signal carries the framing that Harry has not just engaged with a substantive policy question, but has done so from within a specific ideological orientation. The structural meaning is that the Institutional Convention Against Royal Political Commentary has been violated in operational terms, not just in formal terms. The Sussex Commercial Pipeline has now produced material that places Harry within a defined political framework, and the framework will subsequently shape how all his other commentary is read. The Catherine Italy trip operates as the structural counterpoint that anchors the broader broadcast. Catherine's first foreign engagement since her cancer treatment took her to Reggio Emilia, where she engaged with the local early learning research that has operated as her institutional priority since her marriage to William. The Reggio Emilia early learning model is internationally recognized in the early childhood education research community as one of the substantive operational frameworks through which child development can be supported during first years of life. The Italian family care policy operates on the principle that families take primary responsibility for child development, with the state providing supplementary
smart, and people came sort of traveled 3 hours to see her. So yes, she's such a star. And I think the fact that, that they all knew that she had been ill and that she was better, and it was also a solo trip, so everything focused on her. But it was done with such incredible dignity and sort of purpose. And there was absolutely nothing about it which looked like a sort of staged, set-up thing like we've seen with certain other.
The Reggio Emilia model extends the principle into community-based early learning infrastructure that supports families operating in this framework. Catherine's research engagement was structured to learn how the model operates and to bring back operational insights for application to United Kingdom early learning policy. The audience response to Catherine's Italian engagement was on Vickers' structural framing, comparable in operational register to Princess Diana's foreign engagements in the equivalent stage of her institutional development. Crowd members travelled 3 hours to see her. The framing they brought to the engagement was the recognition that she had been ill and was now returning to full institutional duty. The substantive content of the engagement was the policy research she was conducting. The combination of recovery framing and substantive policy work produced the operational response that her solo tour generated.
Because a columnist in the Daily Mail on Saturday, Amanda Platel, I would have given her more credit for what she wrote, because quite frankly, it was nonsense, because she criticized Catherine for the time that she spends on early learning, because it comes from a woman writing who doesn't have children, who hasn't been married. Well, she has, but she's been divorced, but she hasn't got children and doesn't understand.
The structural meaning is that Catherine has now demonstrated operational capacity to perform at the highest level of institutional duty after recovering from a serious medical condition. And the demonstration has reached the audience environment that the institutional architecture requires. The structural distinction between Catherine and Diana that Vickers and Arbiter develop is consequential for understanding the operational character of the Cambridge institutional positioning. Diana, on Vickers's framing, may not have consciously intended to compete with Charles, but the operational outcome was that competition substantially emerged. Charles would make a speech and the audience focus would migrate to Diana. Diana might cross her legs or make a gesture, and the news cycle would orient around her. The structural feature of this dynamic was that the institutional architecture was disrupted by the magnetism Diana brought to public engagements. Catherine, by contrast, does not compete. She did not compete with William, she does not compete with Charles, she did not compete with the late Queen.
If you see them, like I see them frequently traveling on London's Underground, where you've got a mother or a carer on the telephone yakking away, the child is whinging, they give the child a telephone so they can watch a video. That is not bringing up a child. And what Catherine is doing is trying to get people to get their children and to teach their children, to show their children how to read, to encourage their children how to read.
The structural meaning is that Catherine has internalized the institutional architecture in a way Diana did not, and operates within it as a supportive figure rather than as a parallel center of attention. The audience response to Catherine therefore does not produce the institutional disruption that Diana's engagements sometimes generated. The further distinction Arbiter develops is between the tactile engagement model Diana deployed and the communicative engagement model Catherine has developed. Diana picked children up, she hugged them, she physically engaged in ways that the period's institutional expectations did not require. Catherine squats down to talk to children, she brings herself to the children's level rather than bringing them up to her level. She communicates rather than embracing. The structural feature of this approach is that it produces operational engagement without the boundary issues that physical, tactile engagement can generate at scale. Catherine's children also engage with the children she meets in ways that reflect a sustained family practice rather than a constructed institutional posture. The institutional pattern is therefore one of communicative connection rather than physical absorption, and the pattern is operationally sustainable across the duration of the institutional career. The structural confidence Catherine brings to her institutional role is the additional analytical observation worth presenting. Diana, on the documented record, did not have the operational confidence to balance her institutional position with her personal positioning. The vulnerability that audiences found compelling about Diana was also the operational feature that made her institutional sustainability difficult. Catherine, by contrast, brings what Arbiter and Vickers both identify as a stable confidence to her role. The confidence is operationally rooted in her family stability, her marital partnership with William, and her successful navigation of the institutional preparation phase before she became a senior royal.
The Prince and Princess of Wales have defined their interests and have committed to these interests because we believe them and it gives them credibility when they talk on these topics versus bouncing from whatever is trending at the time and just trying to hijack a little bit of excitement happening over here about this charity or whatever compared to the other pair.
The audience response to her does not require the protective disposition that audiences extended to Diana. The audience responds to Catherine as a confident figure operating in a sustainable institutional role. The Catherine Italian language capacity is the additional structural detail Vickers and Arbiter develop. Catherine studied at the British Institute in Florence for several months before commencing her degree at the University of St Andrews. The institutional training included Italian language study, art history, and the cultural framework that the British Institute curriculum is structured around. Her use of Italian during the Reggio Emilia engagement therefore drew on operational language capacity that the audience may not have known she had. The structural meaning is that the language capacity was developed during her pre-marriage formation and has been retained and deployed at the moment when the operational context made it relevant. The depth of preparation behind the engagement is consistent with the broader pattern of Catherine's institutional development. The substantive policy work, the language capacity, the operational discipline of the engagement, and the strategic timing of the trip all reflect the kind of sustained preparation that the institutional architecture requires for the next reign. The Daily Mail Saturday column by Amanda Patel that criticised Catherine's early years' work is the structural counter-development that the broadcast addresses with operational dismissiveness. Patel's column argued that Catherine had spent years on the early years project without producing visible operational outcomes. Arbiter's structural response is that the column reflects the underlying problem in much mainstream royal commentary, which is that the commentators producing the criticism often lack the personal experience or substantive engagement with the policy area that would qualify them to assess the work. Arbiter notes that Patel does not have children and has been through a divorce, indicating that her personal framework for engaging with early childhood policy is operationally different from the framework that the substantive research community brings to the same questions. The structural meaning is that the criticism reflects the commentator's positioning rather than the substantive evaluation of the work. The early years research is, on the documented record, generating systemic outcomes through the Business Task Force, the Shaping Us campaign, and the broader policy engagement Catherine has been conducting across more than a decade. The structural framing Arbiter develops on why early childhood policy matters is worth presenting because it captures the operational substance of Catherine's work. Arbiter's framing is operationally direct.
When, at the time of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, she stayed at Balmoral to be with her grandchildren rather than coming down to London, not really knowing what to do and people demanding. But William is got his priorities right because children need their parents at this early age, and Catherine's making sure that's happening.
Children who do not receive sustained adult engagement during the early years, including parental engagement with reading, conversation, and developmental support, will be operationally disadvantaged for the rest of their lives. The pattern Arbiter observes on the London Underground, in which a carer is on the telephone while a child watches a separate video, is the operational expression of the developmental risk. The structural intervention Catherine's work is designed to support is the conversion of parental and carer attention from device-mediated engagement back to direct child engagement. The intervention is substantively important because the developmental window for early childhood support closes operationally as the child ages. Failure to intervene during the relevant window produces costs that persist across the child's lifetime. The Vickers framing on the broader Cambridge institutional positioning is the structural observation worth presenting. The successful members of the royal family are, on Vickers's professional reading, the ones who support but do not compete.
Necessarily have been Diana's fault is, of course, that Catherine does not compete. She doesn't compete with Prince William, she doesn't compete with the King, she didn't compete with Queen Elizabeth II. Whereas Diana, maybe she didn't intend to, but she certainly, was left with that. We are left with that impression that it was all to do with her. That Prince Charles would be making a speech, and people would be looking at her. If there was something happening, she might cross her legs or make a funny gesture or something, and the world turned on her.
The institutional architecture is designed to produce sustained support for the reigning monarch from the wider family, with the family operating as the institutional infrastructure on which the monarchy depends. Competition between family members damages the architecture because it directs operational attention toward intra-family dynamics rather than toward the substantive institutional work the family is supposed to be performing. Harry, in Vickers's framing, is in competition with the rest of the institutional family. The Sussex commercial pipeline operates on a competitive framework against the substantive Cambridge institutional work. The structural meaning is that the comparison the public performs between the Sussex output and the Cambridge output, with a comparison consistently favouring the Cambridge side, is the operational consequence of Harry's strategic choice to compete rather than to support. The Kemi-Badenoch monarchy framing that Schofield introduces is the structural political context worth presenting. Badenoch, as leader of the British Conservative opposition, was asked in a recent interview whether the United Kingdom still needs a monarchy. Her response was that the country is operationally better off with King Charles as head of state than it would be with Keir Starmer in the same role.
So they are two very different women. Diana with children, she was tactile, she picked them up, she hugged them. Catherine doesn't. She squats down to talk to them, might take their hand, but she's not a hugger. And I think that is important. Catherine knows exactly where to draw the line. She brings herself down to the same level as the children, or sometimes tries to bring the children up to her level. She doesn't talk down to them.
The structural meaning of this framing is that the contemporary British political class, including the opposition leadership, is operationally invested in the continued legitimacy of the institutional monarchy as a counterweight to political turbulence. The Starmer government has reached an operational position of substantial public difficulty, and the monarchy provides the institutional stability that the political class cannot itself produce. Vickers' structural framing on the question is that the monarchy operates above politics, which allows it to be respected across political affiliations regardless of the partisan dispositions of individual citizens. Arbiter's structural framing is that the United Kingdom is operationally better off with a non-political head of state than with the executive head of state configurations operating in France and the United States, where the political position of the head of state directly affects the operational legitimacy of the role.
They lost so many seats and she's had to work hard to pull them together. I don't think she's fully completed the job in pulling them together. There are still sort of side issues that certain members don't have confidence in her. She's a very good orator. She's very good at the dispatch box. And if they give her a chance, she can do something with the Conservative Party.
The Charles state visit to Washington demonstrated the operational advantage. Charles, as non-political head of state, was able to address the joint session of the United States Congress in a way that delivered substantive criticism of the Trump administration's positions in a register that political figures cannot replicate, and Trump received the criticism without operational retaliation. The state opening of Parliament that Charles and Camilla recently attended is the additional institutional engagement worth presenting because it captures the structural pressure the institutional architecture has been operating under during the current period of political instability. The palace was reportedly concerned about the operational risk of conducting the full state opening pageantry, including the substantial deployment of crown jewels and ceremonial infrastructure, when the Starmer government's operational stability was sufficiently in question that the relevant legislative programme might not survive to implementation. The structural decision to proceed with the state opening reflected the institutional principle that the monarchy operates regardless of the political weather. Vickers' framing is that pulling the king out of the state opening would have produced substantially more institutional damage than proceeding through the ceremony, despite the political uncertainty around its substantive implementation.
Sitting in an interview and somebody said something along the lines of like, do we need a monarchy still? And she said, we're better off with King Charles as our head of state than Keir Starmer, who, I mean, by the time this airs, might not be the prime minister anymore. There's so much chaos surrounding the current prime minister, Keir Starmer. The
arbiter ventriloquist dummy framing is the structural assessment of Harry's current operational position. Harry is, on arbiter's reading, behaving like a figure through whom other parties deliver their own operational content. The parties pulling the strings are operating outside the documentary record in any direct sense, but their work product appears under Harry's name in the New Statesman essay, the Kiev Security Forum address, and the various other public communications the Sussex household has produced across recent months. The structural meaning is that Harry's personal voice has been substantially displaced by the constructed voices of the operational team that surrounds him. The voice the audience encounters in Harry's public communications is therefore not the voice of the man whose institutional formation the audience watched develop across his earlier life. It is the voice of the commercial pipeline that has been built around him. The audience can read the difference, and the reading produces the structural disbelief that the Sussex commercial output now consistently generates. The title-stripping concern Vickers raises in response to the broadcast's question is the additional structural element worth presenting. Vickers's framing is that he does not, in his own analytical disposition, raise the question of whether Harry should still have his royal titles. He does note, however, that the operational ease with which the institution has demonstrated it can remove titles through the Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor precedent indicates that Harry should be operationally careful. The structural meaning is that the institutional mechanism for title removal now exists in fresh institutional memory. The mechanism is operationally available when the reigning monarch determines that the circumstances require its application. Vickers's professional position is that if he were in Harry's position, he would be operationally worried. The framing is delivered with care, but carries the institutional weight of the assessment. The arbiter framing on the underlying structural inconsistency of Harry's current positioning is the closing analytical observation worth presenting. Harry is either a prince of the United Kingdom or he is not. The two configurations cannot operate simultaneously. He cannot conduct himself in ways that violate the institutional conventions for senior royals, including the prohibition on political commentary, while continuing to expect that the public will address him with the institutional forms of respect that the title carries. The structural inconsistency is operationally untenable. The Sussex household's commercial strategy depends on the continued deployment of the title, even as the underlying conduct violates the conventions the title presupposes. The audience reading this configuration accurately reaches the conclusion that the structural inconsistency cannot be sustained indefinitely. Either the conduct must conform to the title conventions, or the title must be removed to reflect the actual operational positioning of the household. The closing observation is that the Harry New Statesman publication, the Catherine Italy success, the Patel Daily Mail column, and the Charles Golders Green engagement are facets of the same broader structural configuration. The institution is performing substantive policy and diplomatic engagement at the highest operational level. Catherine is demonstrating that the next generation succession infrastructure is operationally robust. Charles is conducting institutional duty, including engagement with communities recovering from anti-Semitic violence. The Sussex household is producing content that competes with these substantive engagements through calibrated timing, while simultaneously violating the institutional conventions the household's continued title deployment. Presupposes the audience reads the contrast accurately. The institutional response has consolidated through the let them doctrine. The title removal mechanism is operationally available. The cumulative documentary record continues to expand. The runway on the Wakeford analysis is approximately 5 years. Within that window, the operational pressure will continue to intensify, the institutional contradictions will continue to deepen, and the cumulative pattern that Vickers, Arbiter, and the broader independent commentary network have documented will continue to consolidate. The verdict is in, the mathematics continue to work through, the institutional architecture continues to operate at the substantive level that has now been reaffirmed through Catherine's Italian engagement and Charles's Golders Green visit. The Sussex contribution to the same news cycle continues to operate as the operational illustration of what departing the institutional architecture produces in the longer term.